In the winter and the snow and the cold and all of that, it's been a kind of a strange thing here. We hope it's all going to work. Had a few technical problems, and I think part of it's with my brain. I had, if anybody should know when we're meeting here, it should be me, right? And I'm thinking it's Monday night, and then all of a sudden this truth dawns on me, and here I am under literally hundreds of pictures and many books and trying to make a story out of this that makes any sense and get all the pictures together. So I've just been kind of hurried, so we're going to hope that turns out okay. But next month, yes, next month Bill Casey is coming in, and Bill is going to give a program that I think you're going to find very interesting. I had him write it up, and being the brilliant person that I am, I left it in the car. But anyhow, I'll tell you pretty much what he said. And what he said is that Mike Shea's wife was very eager to take pictures of early Fabius. And between the time that they married in 1910 and the time of her untimely death in 1926, there were a great many pictures here. And Bill was able to get permission. I guess what they found was a stack of negatives. And Bill got permission to develop these negatives. And then he got family help. I think Mrs. DeMong it was. But anyhow, family help to identify the people and the places and the events. So what we have for next month, first Saturday, 1 o'clock, Bill Casey here, what we have is something that I think you're going to find very interesting. And it's like a treasure trove of pictures and memories and so forth. And so that's going to be coming up. Don't miss that. Well, we'll see how well this goes and see if it really makes some sense. But I talked to you before about the Syracuse in the 19th century, in the 1800s. And what I want to do now is kind of bring you up to date and talk about the history of Syracuse in the 20th century. So it's really like, if you want to give it a dateline, Syracuse in the life of Dwayne Skeel, born in 1901, right? And so the things you're going to see are many things that maybe he saw. So we'll take a look at that. I also want to be thankful and grateful and admit that I am so happy that there were people over the years who could look at pictures and say, we've got to preserve this. And the Onondaga Historical Association has done a marvelous job. I want to give Dennis Connors some credit on this, because they took the pictures, they interpreted them, they wrote captions, they put them in books, and they put them into the public domain. I hope. If I get arrested during the meeting, you'll know I was wrong on that one. But anyhow, let's take a look at this. One of the things, what you're going to see here is that Syracuse grew. Oh, by the way, our sound system is not working either. So if you can't hear me, raise your hand. Many factors contributed to the growth of Syracuse. And I believe the high point in our population was reached somewhere about 1950, when the population stood at about 200,000 in Syracuse. Now, since that time, it's gone downhill, and it's much lower. But anyhow, so that's what happened. Well, why did it grow? Well, first of all, fertile soil. And some of you guys are saying, yeah, I made it fertile by all the work I did. I was raised in the Midwest, Illinois. Grew up in the Chicago area. But between my sophomore and junior year in high school, I got this brilliant idea, wouldn't it be fun to work on a farm? And I did, downstate Illinois. Later on, a high school teacher told me that the topsoil in certain parts of Illinois are like 50 feet deep. Excellent. But I also remember in my high school days attending church and hearing and being in prayer meetings where people were praising and asking the Lord to send water. And we have adequate water here. In fact, one day I asked Dwayne, I said, do you ever remember a drought here? And he said no, he could not remember that. So this is one thing. 1825, the Erie Canal came into place. Somebody got the brilliant idea with people and animals. You can dig hundreds of miles to make a usable canal. People thought they were crazy, but it worked. And so you can take and move things. You can go from New York City up the Hudson River, across the Erie Canal to the western part of the state. You can go up the Oswego Canal from here and get into the lake and get into the St. Lawrence River. Wonderful things. So this made a tremendous difference. Bill Casey often talks about the land grants given to soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Some of them got a lot, 600 acres. Some of the officers got more. And so this brought people in. And then the central location, and the reason I put that in parentheses is, at one time, this might have been central. But as the country moved west, 3,000 miles across the country, east to west, as the country moved west, we're really not central anymore. And I think that's had an impact on our business and manufacturing and so forth. The railroads began to spread somewhere around 1840. And so you can lay track, you can move things around. And by the way, this is very important. If you look at the history of Syracuse University, it started as Genesee Seminary, somewhat north or somewhat near Rochester in Lima, New York. And
spelled L-I-M-A.
L-I, yeah.
Oh, Lima, that's where my son lived.
Okay, Lima, good. But back then, it started in the 1830s. Later on, they developed a college, Genesee College. But according to one of the sources I read, the train didn't even stop there. And so you got to have a good problem getting students and supplies onto that place. And so that didn't help. And eventually, Syracuse made the bid and got the thing here. Okay, and later Syracuse University developed because of that one particular problem. I want to give this guy some credit. Here you see Edison and his electrifying life. Now, the way we use those terms these days, you might think, oh, we're going to learn about his sex life and what he did. No, no, no. He did teach the country a lot about how to use electricity. And once that was done, a whole lot of opportunities opened up, which we'll talk about later. I ran across this in getting the pictures and the stories together. And let me make sure I know where I am. I think I'm going to leave that and go back to that. This could be one of the strangest graphs you're ever going to see in your life. Back in 1897, somebody got the brilliant idea to put together a graph here and say, okay, this area grew, population expanded, people moved in. Where'd they come from? And so they're asking back in the 1897, they're asking, what, how many of these people are foreign born? And the size of the people here are going to tell you how many people are foreign born. Well, Germans, number one.
German beer.
That's exactly right. So when you got Germans, you're going to have, as Linda says, maybe from personal experience, I don't know, you're going to have beer. And in fact, at one time, Syracuse was a hub of beer brewing. Now, Haberly is just one of the names here that some of you may have heard and remember. One of the problems with the beer brewing here, because at one time it was big, this was really a huge thing, is that in 1920, the country talked to itself and they said, you know, we've got a lot of people who drink too much. And maybe if we could stop this alcohol drinking, the country would get more godly and nicer and better. And so they passed the amendment. Started with the Volstead Act in Congress, and it became an amendment to the Constitution, and suddenly we had prohibition. Started in 1920, and it went on until 1933, when we had a president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who liked to have a little bit to drink every now and then and serve his guests and so forth. Well, a lot of the breweries did not survive prohibition, so that's one of the problems. Second, Irish. Now, there could be a lot of reasons why the Irish came here, and some of you may be Irish and you could give me some reasons. But certainly one of them was when they dug the canal, Irish workers were extremely important in that. They did a lot of the work to dig out that canal. That's one of the things. In the 1840s, there was the Irish potato famine. Their diet was kind of zeroed in on potatoes, and when they failed, they really were hungry, and many migrated because of that. And of course, in many of the larger cities, Irish people became part of the police force and public service and officials of the cities and so forth. Number three are the Italians. And in Syracuse, of course, there were sort of German areas north of the downtown, Italian areas sort of north of the downtown. And then things really drop off. There's the English, there's the Canadians. You may wonder about those Canadians. Why are they, what are you doing, guy? Why'd you come here?
Warmer.
Avoid the snow? Not a good idea. And so forth. And over here, the Poles. I think there's something here which is maybe not something that's people talk about a lot, but there was a time in our history when people thought that we're going to let immigrants in, but they've got to be the bright ones, the good ones, people like us, the Western European people. And then after we get out of Western European, things kind of drop off. And so the Poles and the Russians here are kind of like a much more Eastern European. And they eventually let some in. And then we've got the Norwegians, the Scotch, the French, the Swiss, the Austrians, Swedes, Danes, Hungarians, and Chinese. By the way, when they do these days, when they do a poll to see who's the happiest, what country are people the happiest in? Do you know?
Denmark.
Denmark, exactly, Denmark. I don't know why, but they are. Well, one of the things, if you're going to have people coming in, they're going to want jobs. You want money to build buildings and make improvements and maintain the place. And so what are you going to have? And this is kind of a nice piece here because it shows some of the products that were made here around the turn of the century. Franklin cars. I was really surprised when I saw how early they started making Franklin cars here. And the date is 1902. The Franklin car had a lot going for it. People praise it for good looks, for good engineering. They like that. It was air-cooled, which means you don't have to worry about radiators and antifreeze and all of that. And so the Franklin cars were produced in 1902. We don't still make Franklin cars here. And of course, the reason is, you can guess, in 1929, there was an event that shook the whole nation, of course, and it was the stock market crash. Irene and I were visiting in the Galapagos Islands in 2008, and we were getting reports from the New York Times as we were aboard ship, which was telling us that our money was gurgling right down the drain in 2008, but fortunately it came back. In 1928, it didn't come back, 1929 did not come back that soon. And by 1934, they couldn't make a profit. They couldn't keep manufacturing Franklin cars. At one point, the Franklin Car Company in Syracuse was the biggest employer in the city. They were employing something like 1,500 people. And they turned out a wonderful car. We'll see some pictures a little bit later on. Bradley wagons. Well, everybody needs to get around. Stearns bicycles. We showed you a picture in the last talk of wagon loads of Stern bicycles that are going to be moved to San Francisco. They're going to go 3,000 miles to be sold. That must have been a really good bicycle, I would think. Syracuse Arms Company. They make guns, as you can guess. And some of the guns, way back then, cost as much as $500. This must have been an incredible gun. The Syracuse Stove Works, in business for a very long time. And what they're saying is that they're proud of the ornate decoration of these things. And you can see, this could be very useful. You don't need particular fuel. You can throw some wood in there, corn cobs, whatever you got. And as you cook your food, you're warming up the whole room. And that could be a big advantage. There, that was good. Syracuse chilled plows. The chilled part is sort of telling you something about the way they make this thing. And I've seen letters from a couple of presidents or former presidents of the country thanking this company because they made a really good, affordable plow, and that's what the country needs. And so this is a very important thing. The Dietz Company, they made lanterns, cars, buildings, houses, so forth. So there's a lot of manufacturing going on here. And look at this lady. Look how content she is as she makes love to her typewriter. Now, what happened here? There's a man named L.C. Smith. I don't know why she's doing this. There's a man named L.C. Smith who was a gun maker. He had a company that made guns. And one of his workers said, I just invented something. You may want to see it. He said, yeah, bring it in. And it was some kind of a crude typewriter. And L.C. Smith could see the future in this. He said, yeah, let's get in this business. And so this is one of the L.C. Smith typewriters, and you can see how happy she is to be in the same room with this thing. This is really nice. But that wasn't the only company. Look at this. This is Syracuse, folks. The Monarch Typewriter Company. Look how big that building is. It must have employed hundreds of people there making these typewriters. So somebody said, well, around 1900, they said, well, we might as well call Syracuse the typewriter city, not the salt city. Let's talk about salt for a minute. No, that's not it yet. Let me talk about salt. I had a picture I thought in there. At any rate, the salt was a really, really big deal. And I think the picture that I can't find here that I'm going to show you is a picture of if you're standing like Clinton Square and you're looking north. And what you would see is acre after acre of these salt these salt containers with the roofs on them, so they can evaporate the water with this, using the sun. And then around that are a whole bunch of chimneys sticking up, and the reason they're there is because they're the guys using the heating, using fire, using a big tub to evaporate the water off. But when you get to around 1890, the country has expanded. They've gone west, they've found things. And what they found apparently are places where you can get the salt out a whole lot cheaper than what these guys have done over the decades. And so the salt industry had peaked and it was going down and needed something else to replace it. If I seem a little confused, I think I just figured this out. I couldn't, the worst possible thing just happened. I was very sure I had this program in the computer, and I think what I found is an earlier version of it. So if it sounds a little strange in the organization, that may be what's going on. But here's something. Over the years, as vaudeville grew, as comedians needed somebody to make fun of, more and more they began to make fun of Syracuse, New York. And you say, why? We're doing great. What's wrong with these people? What they would say is the trains ran in the street. And here is an example. Here's the proof of that. See that train there? It is running down Washington Street. If you look at a map, and you've got Erie Boulevard here, and you go just a little south, you're onto Washington Street, and it's going east and west. And for a very long time, the trains ran, and look at the amount of soot and smoke and all of that that's going up. And we got maybe dozens of trains every day that are going through this. If somebody parks their car a little wrong, if somebody slips in the snow, it could be lights out, you see. And you're probably wondering, who designed this? And the answer is, this was made this way on purpose. The merchants, the people that ran the hotels, the people that ran the stores, the people that ran the restaurants, they wanted, when people got off the train, they're going to see our business right there, and they're going to come in maybe and spend their money. It took until 1936 to get rid of this thing, and when it did, we got the Depression, we've got a lot of people needing work, we got money available from the federal government and other places, and so all of that came together, and they made the tracks where you see them and where they are now. They see them, and the big building that was once the train station there is no longer, as you know, but it's now the building for Channel 10 and their news. Well, what else is happening? If you go way back to the 1900 State Fair, 1900. Well, it's got a lovely gate and an office and so forth, but look here. Here's a wagon, here's some horses, and here's a motorized vehicle, here's a motorized vehicle, that already in 1900, we've got people driving cars. In fact, let me tell you something about that. I think it was 1900. In the whole state of New York, no, I think I'm wrong, in central New York, the number of people who have cars, 6 people. What did they do? They were so happy and exuberant, they got together and they formed AAA. What can you say? Now, if that isn't strange enough, there also are people who, this is a 1904 picture, downtown Syracuse. Now you can see the buildings, you know, looking pretty good. We were early about building things, spending money and so forth. But there were people, road races. Now boy, those roads were not very good, but they would do it. And this is one of those road races, and these guys are stopping for lunch in Syracuse, and there they are. I raise this issue for a reason. And that is this. Let me see if my next picture is what I think it is. No, it's not. I thought that was
There, there's the salt.
There's the salt. We found the salt. Okay. At any rate, Look at these guys, working away. For a long time, we're the Salt City. But here's the reason I raise this. The Erie Canal started operation in 1825. It ran for almost 100 years. In the early 1920s, they filled it in. Now, if you're wondering why would they do that after all that work, well, think about this. What's happened? Well, a lot of things. You got railroad tracks running all over the place now. Even here, even down the road. Railroad tracks. People can move, goods can move, all of this is going on, and you can see that. But I think one of the things is, for people driving cars, even though the first ones ran like 4 miles per hour, for people driving cars, they get impatient. They want to get to point A to point B sooner. And if you look along the Erie Canal, you would see bridges. Now, some of them, none of them are real high. Remember that old song, Low Bridge, everybody down, low bridge coming to a town. If you're ever navigating on the Erie Canal, if you don't go low, you could have your head knocked off. But they worked on these things. And in many cases, the bridge had to be movable. So when it's down, you can drive your horse and buggy across, or you can drive your car across. But the canal boats can't get through underneath. There's not enough room. And so you got to be able to move that up. And when you move it up, you'll see maybe a stairway. If you're walking, no big problem. You walk up the stairs, cross the road, walk down the stairs. Might help you lose weight. What's wrong with that? But for the cars, people can get impatient. And I think that's one of the reasons why they began to fill in the canal. They got tired of waiting for those blasted bridges. I think that's one thing. A second reason, maybe more important even, was the New York State canal system put the canals in a little different location, and they moved the canals a little bit north. They don't have to come into Clinton Square anymore. They don't have to come along Erie Boulevard anymore. Now, Irene and I moved here in 1962, and it seemed to me that even back then, as you drove along Erie Boulevard, it was kind of bumpy. It would be holes and so forth. I think it took a long time after they began filling in the canal to really get it solidified and down. But that was something else that they did. So railroads, and then pretty soon you've got gasoline engine powered things that are moving goods around. You don't need the canals anymore. But at one time, James Street was like Nirvana. What you wanted to do is start your business, make a lot of money, and then buy a house on James Street. Here's an example. The Saul house. I don't know what Saul did, but he's got 3 little packages from heaven here sitting on his steps. The house is well designed. It's got masonry. It's got wood. It was probably very expensive to build. Where'd that money come from? I don't know where his came from, but here's the kind of thing. Sanderson Steel Company along the canal. Look how big that is. A different view of that would show a lot of smoke coming out of the chimneys. They didn't worry about smoke back in those days. A lot of smoke coming out of the chimneys. This became eventually crucible steel, but you get an idea about the manufacturing and the money changing hands. Here's one of our guys, John Archbold. Now, apparently he was Rockefeller's right-hand man, John Rockefeller. And this guy was so good that apparently Rockefeller sent a lot of money his way. And after Rockefeller retired, I think he retired before 1907, John Archbold came. He was also serving on Syracuse University committees. He was part of the committee structure. He had connections with the university, and he realized that that big wooden football field was really not adequate. And he thought big, and he said, you know, what you need to do is make a stadium out of concrete. And they said, well, that's not done. And he said it could be done. I think John Archbold actually put in something like $3 million in 1907 money to buy all they needed to put this big Archbold Stadium in place. Here's a guy over here who's trying to find a comfortable place, and I have sat there a couple of times, and I can tell you there is no comfortable place in Archbold Stadium. And I think all of you probably remember something about 1980, when the tremendous demolition job was done to break this thing up and to build the dome. And then football became a lot more fun. This is not on James Street, but the Yates family, at one point, I don't know how they made their money either, but the Yates family lived in what some people saw as the most elegant building in the city, possibly. Look, they called it Yates Castle, at least they did later. And what happened here is that in 1954, it's being destroyed. As a matter of fact, that is really what happened to so many of the buildings on James Street.
It's a hotel.
Hotels.
No, that's what he built, Yates.
Oh,
You remember how
okay.
they had the yard of here?
Okay, no, you're right, I didn't think of that. Yeah, and the Yates Hotel, I've seen a picture, it was really immense, really big.
That's gone too.
Train was.
Yeah, that was torn down too.
This was the journalism school at SU.
It was, yeah, the journalism school for many years, used by SU. And one of the reasons, there was a time when Syracuse University also owned the medical school. And the medical school, I think, was not given over to the state, I think, until around 1950. So at one time, SU also ran the medical school. And apparently in around 1950, they realized that it made a lot of sense to turn this over to the state of New York. I think it did make a lot of sense. But here's what's happening in 1954. They're tearing this down because the medical school is going to expand. And the only part of this, I believe, the only part of this left, if you go there, you know what it is?
Is there still a gate, a fence?
A fence. There's a lovely stone fence right near the sidewalk. That's all that's left of Yates, of the Yates Castle. So,
What street? What street?
Krause.
It's between Krause Hospital and the
Yeah.
VA.
It's, in fact, let's see what's coming up here now.
It's near the
I'm getting
emergency
surprised here, folks. I
room
got
in
the
Cross
wrong-
Hospital.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's that area, which, you know, has medical school in it. I'm not sure. I'm not coming up with the right things here. But later on, maybe, if we live long enough, we may see a picture of a convertible car coming in to that area. And President Roosevelt is sitting in the back seat, waving his hat at the crowd. And Governor Lehman is there, and Mayor Marvin are there, and they are there to participate in some expansion of the medical school back in the 1930s. So this goes way back. And I think one day I was in that medical school building looking around, and I believe, I haven't been in it for several years, I believe they had cases that show some things that they used in the dedication ceremony. You'll see President Roosevelt in one of the pictures laying the cornerstone. Well, here's a guy with polio. He's not going to, you know, heft around the big stones. But what he was doing is taking the trowel and putting some mortar where it belonged and laying the cornerstone. Well, that trowel, I think, is still there. Somebody used a shovel with a kind of a silver tip on it, and that's still there, so you can still see some of those things.
Is that Cross Hospital you're talking
Yes.
Well, anyhow, some terrible things happened in the 20th century, and this is one of them, I think. 1917, we got in April of 1917, we got into what we now call World War I. It was also called the War to End All Wars, and of course it did not do that, unfortunately. But here we see some of the people here, some of the men kissing goodbye and shaking hands and so forth, and going off to be trained for World War I. As a matter of fact, what the government did is take the fairgrounds north of the city and set up buildings, set up tents, set up bags here that you can take your bayonet and practice knifing people on that very place. And then in April of 1917, they'd be sent overseas, and the war ended, as I think you know, the war ended in November of 1918. So we're in it for about a year and a half plus. Such a war. What they're claiming now, the historians claim that during the war, which was such a violent thing, the war eventually, in fact, the people, when the war started for the Europeans in 1914, most of those people thought, this will be over in about 4 months, we'll be home for Christmas, this craziness will be gone. And it wasn't. 10 million people perished. And you can easily see why. Much of the war fought in trenches, and this group decides they're going to attack these guys. They come up over here. These guys are, whoa. What else can go wrong? These guys have maybe machine guns, they've got automatic weapons, they can just shoot you down. And it goes on, back and forth, kill more people. There's one thing that I ran across just this morning, and they said there was a kind of a truce the very first Christmas. And the war's going on, the guys are in the trenches, they're trying to kill each other, and Christmas Eve, the Allies can hear from the trench over here, the Germans are singing Silent Night, Still a Night. And so they said, well, let's us sing. And so they start singing, All Come All You Faithful. And pretty soon, the hymn, the Christmas carol singing sort of goes back and forth. And finally, some German sends a note over to the trench in the British side, and they invite somebody to come over for a glass of wine. Now, you would think not many people would do that, but somebody did. And he took a cake with him to give the Germans, and they gave him some wine. And pretty soon, the guys are coming out of the trenches, and they're mixing and mingling and telling jokes and shaking hands and saying Happy New Year. What's going on? Well, eventually, things get back to normal. The Germans send a note out. Hostilities are now resumed. And so, that was the end. And apparently it never happened again. But, consider this. When many of these soldiers got back at the end of the war, and many civilians living here at the end of the war, Spanish flu came. And they're claiming that the Spanish flu probably took as many as 20 million people. So you've got 10 million people killed in hostility in the battles. You've got 20 million killed because of Spanish flu. Let's see if we can do anything with this. That's a hard time to be alive. The war ended November of 1918. But like so many wars, it's followed by kind of a brief recession. And in 1920, there was a brief recession. It didn't last long. But it did drive some people out of business. And one of those people is Harry Truman. Harry Truman could not keep his haberdashery shop open any longer, and he closed it. But people have said this, to Harry Truman's credit, he spent the rest of his life, he didn't declare bankruptcy, he spent the rest of his life trying to pay back every debtor that he owed money to. And I think he succeeded. Well, World War I, what are they saying? You know, we need money. Buy bonds, buy Liberty loans, buy bonds, and so forth, and colorful things like this. For many of you people remember World War II. We did sort of like that. Even in school, we'd buy savings stamps. And you get enough of those, and maybe you can get a bond, and so forth. But borrowing money. The war ends, and this happens to be a picture in Syracuse because it happens to be Syracuse soldiers. This war, it is said, is the last war in which they would form companies from a particular location. Now, if you go to war, if you join up, doesn't matter where you're from, they'll put you where they want you. But these guys are coming home, the war is over, and they survived because the casualty rate must have been just extremely high for these guys. Well, go back a few years again. This is about turn of the century vehicle. Now, I don't know about this guy. You know, is he her chauffeur? He's kind of dressed up. Is he her husband who just wants to look dressed up and so he put the cap? I don't know. But if you look at women over a number of decades of the early 20th century, when they went out, put the hat on. Put the hat on, and there she's got the hat. Let's get back to Franklin cars. As you know, there is a Franklin car meet every year. And these people, these collectors, they feel like lucky people if they can find a good Franklin and fix it up and come to the meet and brag about it. This one, I think, was never really sold. It was actually made for one of the chief executives of the Franklin Company. And I put down as kind of a concept car, you know. Look at this guy. Boy, wouldn't a collector love to have that one? That is a beauty. There's the shop where these guys are doing some of the work. We're making Franklin cars, but look how big that is. Look at the length of that hood. The Great Depression came along, and these cars that must have sold well for a long time couldn't make it. And the Franklin Company just kind of slipped out of existence. But they had some fun. These are ladies, and I don't know what this means. It could be they work for the company, but if that's the case, they're taking them on a picnic in 1911. And if you look in every single one, that she's got her hat in place, looks about the same.
And a man is driving those vehicles, right?
And a man is driving the vehicle, but she gets to sit in the back seat.
Good thing you didn't live back then.
I think we have a vote against this practice.
The one on the right is right-hand drive. The car on the right is on right-hand drive.
They
Yes, they are right-hand drive too. Right. So they're going to go out for the picnic. Women, they probably thought they were honoring these people to put them in the back of the bus.
I don't think so.
We better move on here, folks. We're real short of time.
That's why the women all wore hats. It's
They
more
did
wind
indeed.
the
In
back.
fact, men did too. If you were to look at a picture of people attending professional baseball games, you would see a sea of men, and if it's summer, maybe a straw hat, round straw hat on, and they all look the same. The hats all look the same. That's what they did. In fact, my father, who was born in 1911, I think he lived through that period, of course, but I think he never got over it. And every time he went out, no matter what the temperature was, put the hat on. If we had more time, we'd show you downtown views, and many times when you see a lot of stores like on Salina Street, some of them are going to be hat stores. The hats are that important. Look at this. 1910. This is kind of interesting, because it looks like this is kind of a multi-purpose shop here. They're selling gas lights and electric supplies. Seem like a couple of different kinds of things. They're selling bicycles, but they're also selling motorcycles. And if you look, there is a motor on every one of these things. They're motorcycles. And the gasoline engine, I think, was just an enormous invention in terms of changing people's lives. There's Franklin cars. I think in their peak, they're turning out, look at that, 60 cars per day. It's not Ford, but it's a lot of cars. 60 cars per day coming off the assembly lines. And look at this one. This picture was taken in 1934, or I said no more after 1934, but I think this must be one of the later models. It just is a lovely looking car, just a beautiful kind of thing. Oh, this is fun. This is fun. I said we get water here. You already knew that. And this is, believe it or not, Washington Street. And I don't know what happened, but it must have been a lot of rain. And for some reason, this locomotive is trying to get through, apparently underestimating the depth and the amount of water. This over here is different. This is some kind of a global flood in one of the streets. But let's go with the locomotive here. I think there must be some kind of thinking here. You know, like on a sinking ship, the captain is the last one off. Some captains don't go by that, like that guy in Italy.
Yeah.
It looks like the conductor is the last one off, and he seems to be clutching something in his shirt there, so maybe he's taking some valuable papers with him, whatever. But this actually happened here on Washington Street in Syracuse. And again, this is all prior to 1936, because then they really changed things around. Oh, I'm glad we got this one. Glad we got this one. Does the name Billy Sunday mean something to any?
No, yes.
Evangelist.
Okay. Okay.
Bible meetings.
Well, back in my youth, my family belonged to a Baptist church, and for many years the minister was kind of a stodgy old guy, and he was not charismatic, and he wore high shoes like a farmer, and he'd get up and but every so often, an evangelist would come to town and really shake things up, and the music would get loud and the singing would get spirited. This is one of the guys who shook things up, and he came to Syracuse at least twice, 1915 and 1924. This, I wasn't dated, but he looks pretty young. I think it could be 1915. And I think what he's saying here, according to the caption, is, "Look out, devil, I'm going to give you a kick." Well, I read about this guy. He really died before I ever got to see him, but I read about him. And they said that seeing him in action was like seeing a kind of a gymnast and a theologian combined. And the things this guy would do were just amazing. Look at this next picture here. Uh-oh. Look at this next picture. Before he would come into a city, they would often build a very gigantic, we would say, tabernacle out of wood. And I'm guessing that after he left, they would tear all this down. My mother would say about evangelists, they come in, they have all the fun, they stir people up, and then when everything is boiling, they leave. And the poor minister has to try to straighten all this out. They were fun. It was fun to see these guys. A friend and I, Gordon Rayberg and I, went to, in high school, took a bus trip down to Gulfport, Mississippi. And the people, our friends down there said, "Hey, you ought to go to church. They got an evangelist coming in," so we did. And this guy comes in, he's dressed to the nines. His name was Ed Martin. He's jumping around, he's getting everybody riled up. It was fun. Well, look at Billy Sunday's bringing them in. They're probably going to fill those benches. They're going to have quite a spirited meeting. And then I was, I think, just starting college, and I got word somehow that a film of Billy Sunday was being shown in a place called Winona Lake, Indiana Conference Ground. And so I got a bunch of guys together, and I just had a car, my first car, and man, was I enjoying it. And so we took the group, the young people group, and went down there, and we saw Billy Sunday on the film. And it was amazing. It was remarkable to see. Well, here's some more memories. We get back to the medical district of Syracuse. What was then Good Shepherd Hospital. If you know the university now, they call it something else, Huntington Hall. Before I retired, I was in the psychology department, and I was stationed in Huntington Hall. Some of the hospital remnants were still there, like little chapel with stained glass windows was still there. I don't think it's still there. But at any rate, that was the way it was. Look, 1910, a couple of cars. This one, you can't tell in the picture, but it's got a blanket over the hood. This poor guy who owned that car was hoping he could keep it warm enough to restart it when he came back. But look at this. You know, cold, snow on the ground, and if you could get a good look at those tires, there's not really much tread on those things. It must have been so hard to get around. Let me say this. When I came to Syracuse University in 1962, this hospital was still being used. And I visited one of my students there. I don't remember his name, but he and his friends went to a football game in Archbold Stadium. And then some brilliant friend said, hey, this guy's not very big. Let's pick him up and kind of move him right down using our hands. They dropped him. You saw, it's concrete. It's not yielding. It's not soft. They dropped him. And he had, I don't know what it was, back injury, neck injury, but I remember going to visit him when this was still a hospital. And the university had rigged up a line from my classroom to his hospital room. And so he and I could talk. If he had a question, he could tell me. And so that was it. If you look at the elevators in Huntington Hall these days, always, they are very long, somewhat narrow, but they're big enough to put a gurney in, and that's still the case. Well, we look at that. It gives Irene and I something to think about, because this is Krause Irving Memorial Hospital, and our kids were born up there, our 2 kids on the top floor. And so we see that, and we're very pleased that every Christmas they celebrate the fact that our kids were born there by putting lights up and everything. It's really very nice. We'll skip over Crucible Steel, but here's something for you, and Eldon, you saw this. This is a guy named E.R. Curley Beta-Von Court. And Don Edwards worked with him for quite a number of years. And I remember on your 25th wedding anniversary,
They were there.
they were there.
Right.
And we got a chance to talk with him. And this is a guy that they call Curly. Now, I think at the time that I met him, he didn't have a lot of hair left. And so I'm wondering, well, is this a nice way of saying, you know, you haven't got much hair left, but we'll still call you Curly? Or was it better in a different time? And I was kind of happy to run across this and
So you
see
he had curls.
he has curls. Curly Beta-Von Court did have curls. He was also, this may surprise you, let me move the next one and maybe back. Oh, at any rate, this is interesting because he was part of one of the very early radio stations here in Syracuse, WSYR. when we did the program on Don Edwards, we talked about some of that. What you may not know is that the very early broadcasting on the radio, the very early broadcasting was done by a man named Clive Meredith. Meredith worked for another man named Melville Clark. And Melville Clark may bring some memories to some of you because he is the guy who started Clark Music Company. He invented some kind of a harp that he sold nationwide, maybe worldwide. And in fact, in looking at my pictures, so many of them I'd see in a little corner of Clark Music Company, as though he's following me around. But at any rate, I can't explain that. But Meredith worked for Clark. And Meredith said, I've been messing around with this thing called radio, and why don't we broadcast something to the Syracuse community? And they did. But in the very early days, Meredith was broadcasting from his family home, I guess it was, on Cazenovia Lake.
Huh.
And I've got a picture of that later on, if I could ever find it, of his home on Cazenovia Lake. And that was started in 1922. That's about right, because here's the thing. The first presidential election, when the results of the election were broadcast on the radio, was in 1920. So when you come to 1922, Syracuse is getting into this radio business really pretty quick, and this guy here has a great deal to do with it. I think I'm going to skip this. It's sad stuff, but oh, here's Clive Meredith's home, 1922. Here's Melville Clark, the Clark Music Company, and somebody at Pompey did a program on a book on the Clark Music Company. And,
Pulling strings.
yeah, and then I think the woman presenting it also gave us a harp symphony or a harp solo. Here's some more names that are part of the media situation. Alexander Casey Jones. Some of you people as old as me may remember when he was a local fixture in journalism here. I put this in case you're kind of interested, what were they showing in the movies back in 1932? James Cagney, The Crowd Roars. Are You Listening? William Haynes. Whatever happened to these great pictures here. Kooky, and so forth. It's kind of fun to look at that and see what they were looking at way back then. I put this in because in 1936, this is one of the last trains that ran. And I think this is really a good-looking train. This is one, it's a steam train, very, very good-looking. This is important.
They got trolley cars before or after?
Yes, the trolley cars go way back. Let me tell you something about the trolley cars. The trolley cars go way back, and in my last talk, I showed you a number of horse-drawn trolley cars. Felt sorry for these poor horses in the snow pulling these things along. Horse-drawn trolley cars. Then, if you get up to later in time, the trolley cars, certainly by 1900, are now running not so much horse-drawn anymore, pretty much gone. But you'll see big wires up here in the sky, and you'll see electric trolley cars. And again, I give the credit, a lot of the credit, to Thomas Edison. And so we had trolley cars. And so you can go pretty much almost anywhere. It's easy to get, say, to Eastwood. So at some point, Eastwood becomes incorporated into Syracuse. That kind of thing was going on. Orville, same thing. So that happened. But then in 1940, one of the books had a picture of a kind of a badge, and it said, the last to ride the trolley cars, 1940. And what they're saying then is that now we've got buses, and the buses will take you anywhere you want to go. But as many of you know, it sure took a long time to get rid of those tracks in the street that we were running over and tripping over, and it took a long time. Well, what about aviation? We got 1903, the Wright brothers flying. By the time you get to 1910, I'm not going to get to the picture here, but by 1910, there is a picture of a plane at the New York State Fair flying around and people are looking at it. Aviation is progressing, but the first airport is not where it is now. The first airport is here at Amboy, and as you may know, Amboy is in the town of Cabillas. This does not look like a big deal. The mayor of Syracuse is in there somewhere. This is the terminal. Not so impressive, right? And over here is a Douglas DC-3. So that's been around a long time. But there was air traffic. People were getting rides, landing at Amboy Airport. And what's happening where the airport is now?
Military base.
Military base. Big planes, B-17s, things like that stored there. Military base. And in fact, after the war, there was still military planes there for a time. And then eventually it became the airport that it is. Chicago, kind of the same thing. The big airport came after World War II. O'Hare. Well, who's it named for? Well, there was a pilot in World War II from Chicago named Butch O'Hare. And he was killed, but they honored him by naming this now incredibly large airport.
And if you look really hard, there's a memorial to him at the airport. It
Is
took
there?
me years to find it.
Okay, you better write it down before something happens to you. Here's
Yeah.
a picture of Roosevelt and Lehman and Mayor Marvin. Just a couple things very quickly. We're kind of running out of time here. And that is this. I saw this picture years ago. I think it was in the medical school library. And this is a way of treating people that I don't think anybody would really accept anymore. But the idea, medically speaking, was that if you want people to stay well and get well, you must give them fresh air. Even if it's in the wintertime, look at these windows. And look how these guys are bundled up. These kids here in the kids' ward are really bundled up. This, by the way, is a picture of a hospital that I did not even know ever existed. And it's what's called Syracuse Women's and Children Hospital. And I'm not sure of the date on this, but it probably goes back a long way. Well, let me give the lady some recognition here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before she
Right,
starts causing
Nancy?
me damage.
We are
Yeah.
We are in
About time.
We are in World War II, and they're, I shouldn't say scrapping women in the same they're collecting scrap, they're recycling to make things, and whether it's rubber or whether it's metal, look at this. I used to fight, now I'm joining this, whatever that says. There was a time, I'd read someplace that during World War II, Michael Shea offered to give the United States government those cannons that are out here in the little park. Now, I know the cannons are still there, and so I asked Charlie, I said, what happened? I read that Michael was going to give these cannons to the government as scrap to be recycled, and they're still there. He said, well, he had a talk with his son, meaning himself. But they estimate there was something like 40,000 men in the Onondaga County area who served in the military, were drafted, joined, whatever, but they were gone. And now we still have the factories. We still need to make the things. The war effort is in high gear, and look what we're doing. Women are now doing it and doing it very well. They're working in factories. You see this happening? Where are your protective goggles? Anyway,
No glasses, no earmuffs.
they are serving. They're serving in the military. You know that? They're actually flying planes. Now, I don't know that they flew planes in combat, but the so-called taxi.
They
Yeah,
had them
not
in the
combat.
Rose Bowl. Didn't you see that one float where all the lady pilots were?
No, I
on that
didn't.
float?
Yeah. Okay.
Rose Bowl parade.
And even in World War II times, they'd make the planes someplace, and they had to taxi them someplace to then be flown out across.
They ferry them over to England.
Yeah,
They ferry them over.
right, that's right. So I think this, flying these airplanes, and I don't know that women ever got enough credit for this. I mean, this was a,
They didn't recognize them until the 1900s, or 1990s.
I mean, look at this. In the 1940s, as you said, they're flying planes across the ocean to England in the 1940s. You go back a few years, 1927, and Lindbergh is becoming world famous for flying a plane across the Atlantic. Now, admittedly, planes improved during that time, but still, anyway, right. I have put together for future reference a book on women working on the atom bomb working in Arizona. And so I made a VD. I've got a disc of this one in case anybody wants it. Certainly working at the USO. And this bottom one, I almost have a question mark, but if my memory is correct, my grandmother claimed that on a regular basis she would meet and make bandages for the war effort.
Yeah.
That's true.
Oh, yeah,
The
they
local
did that.
ladies did that, even the farm ladies.
Chuck,
Now, admittedly, there's trouble. Yeah. Okay.
have any of you been on one of those duck tours like in Baltimore and Albany? It's an amphibian boat, and they'll take you around Albany, and then they take you into the Hudson River and stuff like that, and everybody gets a duck call thing. Well, those were made by women in Maine during World War II. They were amphibian boats, and they're
No,
still using them.
Sounds good. We've seen them in, where do we, Virginia,
Boston,
Boston?
Yeah, they're all over.
Wisconsin.
They still
Yeah.
work.
Sounds good. So, I don't know what the story gets a little worse, of course, because then when the men came back, a lot of these women lost their jobs. At any rate, let me show you this, maybe we'll end with this one. I didn't realize, I've been reading about this guy, that General Jonathan Wainwright was a Skaneateles native. And so he would often come back, even during the war when he could, or other times, and visit family here. But this guy, you see him, looks like he's broadcasting something. He was head of troops that were in Corregidor, in the Pacific, I think in the Philippines. We did not know, they tell us, did not know that the Japanese were going to take such tremendous action and bomb Pearl Harbor. And when they bombed Pearl Harbor, that wasn't all they did. They began to attack American troops other places nearby, such as in Corregidor. Here with Wainwright is another general, Douglas MacArthur. And apparently they were thinking that it is their duty as American generals to stay with the troops, to fight the Japanese as long as they could, even though they needed supplies, they needed to be resupplied, they needed to have more people coming in, but they were going to stay. But President Roosevelt apparently sent a note to MacArthur and he said, "You will leave. We've arranged to have a submarine meet you at a particular point. You will leave and go to either New Guinea or Australia, and I'm going to bring you back because I have a plan for you in the coming war." And so MacArthur did leave. Wainwright did not, and he was not allowed to leave, I guess. What is really happening here, if you see some of this stuff, is that he is broadcasting over Japanese radio that Corregidor has fallen. And the Japanese, of course, are happy to hear this. This picture was part of the Japanese archives. And after the war, years later, it was discovered and came to light, and that's where it is. But look at this next picture. For the entire duration of the war, Wainwright was kept in Japanese prisons. And as you can see, they did not feed our people enough. He looked like that. But look at MacArthur, he's giving him a hug, he's saying nice things, and Wainwright came back, and at the end of that, well, we celebrated that, we made the war memorial, and let's leave you with this one. One of the things, when we talk about flying, our kids did this, maybe your kids did this, but one of the things, okay, there you are. One of the things that was so important about Christmas back in the old days was to go downtown and go through the big stores. And here at Edwards, you've got this train that runs around the ceiling. Well, we just had time for a little bit here, but hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully it brought back some memories for you.
Sure did.
Thank you.
Why do we still have a mindset that we're central New York?
What?
Instead of when?
Instead of you indicated that no
No, he meant
longer central.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, what I was getting at, if you go way back, you know, the 13 colonies are along the eastern seaboard.
Okay,
you know.
yeah.
And as we acquired more land, pretty soon to go from this coast to that one is 3,000 miles. What I didn't show you, let me tell you this, I think you can relate to this, is that, you know, there may have been a time when most people are living pretty close to us, and maybe north and south. If we're manufacturing something, we take it north, we take it south. Now, to take it anywhere, you've got 3,000 miles to cover. We're not really central anymore. But let me tell you this. I think all of you know that one of the things people, maybe you're here, because in the summertime, it gets hot. Not real hot, but it gets hot. So what do? Open your bedroom window, you sleep. Not enough? Put a fan in, draw in some air. If you really can't sleep, you put an air conditioning unit in. Think about this. People probably years ago looked at the South and they said, hey, maybe we should put our factory down here, our offices down there. It's nice, people would like to live there. But they said, oh, the summers are unbearable, they're too hot. One man here, whose name is Willis Carrier, worked hard to put together something that we now call air conditioning. And when he did that, I read this years ago and I still believe it, when he did that, he made it possible to take some of these southern cities down there and air condition the factories, and air condition the offices, and air condition the theaters. In the early days of air conditioning a theater, if it had air conditioning, be a big sign up in front, air conditioning, or maybe something else, refrigerated even they would put up. Look what happened. I think when that happened, the South rose again.
Without a doubt.
And it rose again because of something that we did here. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it, but it really is kind of ironic that air conditioning started here. Hi there, yes.
There's one story related to the Americans and Germans singing it during Christmas time. I read where General Pershing's staff, or General Pershing, found out about the Americans joining and singing with the Germans, and the entire unit, including all of the American officers, were reprimanded and sent back to the rear because Pershing said, we can no longer rely on you to shoot on the Germans because you sang with them. So luckily, all of the American units that were involved in this friendship escaped for the rest of the war, because some of them were sent back early as unproductive soldiers during World War I.
Fraternization.
Yeah, no fraternizing.
How about that? Okay, any other quick comments or memories?
Do people know why we have the QWERTY keyboard on the typewriters and the computers?
No.
Because the typists got so fast that the keys would jam.
Oh,
And they
yeah.
had to rearrange it so to slow them down so that they wouldn't jam them.
Yeah, the QWERTY keyboard.
And we still have it.
We still have it, right? That's it. You guys who never used the typewriter don't know what you were missing. Those were hard days. You do a dissertation like I did and give it, your typist turns it in, you pay her the money, you find mistakes, she retypes it, puts in new mistakes.
That's right.
What's carbon paper for? Have you ever seen carbon paper?
I
Oh,
remember
yeah.
carbon paper.
Stick with the computers, folks. We've got refreshments over here and